Greetings to the Dr. Obata Show. Um, I'm wishing all of you happy holidays, especially happy Kwanzaa. Starting on December 26th through January the 1st, a lot of Africans in this country and around the world will be celebrating Kwanzaa, which is an adaptation of the first fruit ceremonies practiced in Africa, where in a different season, people celebrate bringing in the crops. Maulana Karenga, when he adapted this first fruit ceremonies to Kwanzaa, then he used the analogy of first fruits or the crops you bring into our children. And so Kwanzaa is a time 7 days out of the end of the year, and the first day of the new year, where we celebrate the achievements of our children as our first fruits. So this is a very important holiday, and to get as many millions of people celebrating it, that's quite an achievement. And it indicates some interest in Africa among our people, that they identify with it. So each day of Kwanzaa is dedicated to a principle of Kwanzaa, and usually through public ceremonies. And then the last day of Kwanzaa is in your home, where people do celebrations in their homes. It's not to be confused with Christmas. It's not an alternative to Christmas. People who practice that, it's not intended to be a competition with it. So for people who celebrate it, good, and hope you enjoy yourself. And people who celebrate all the other holidays, including Christmas, good as well. The last two shows of the Dr. Obata Show have focused on economic development. And 2 weeks, actually, a couple of weeks ago, this show focused on the topic of African philosophy and the connection of African philosophy to economic development. Particularly cooperative economic development. And this was put forward as the ideal model for economic development in the community because it grows out of our communal sharing traditions rising out of Africa, where you had very little poverty, no jails, no oppression of women, elders, young people, or no oppression in general. And where nations, until the coming of Islam and Christianity, didn't have standing armies. So they didn't have to invest in a military industrial complex. And the wealth was basically earned by the people through agricultural labor. So cooperative economics is a modern day expression of communalism, where the air, land, and water is owned by no one but shared by everyone. And that's why you had societies where you didn't have great gaps of wealth and poverty. And you didn't have the world, on average, living on $1 or $2 a day. And think about it, a society without prisons, truly a just society. So cooperative economics is the modern day expression of that. It is also an expression not only of sharing of the wealth, but it's also an expression of African democracy, where the people have a say-so in what's being done. And so that was the show on African philosophy and its connection to cooperative economic development. And we need more of it. We have a number of cooperatives in our communities. We have credit unions and things like that that operate on more of a cooperative principle. And a credit union can serve as a better means for financing business than a bank, for for us. And, we have a few left, but these banks usually have trouble surviving because they're in this competitive atmosphere with corporate capitalism, which is the plague on humanity, the big C that nobody wants to touch, because a lot of people are identifying with it, that, they can be a millionaire too. Well, actually, millions ain't much now, but for the average Black person, it would be a lot. But where you have billionaires and some now approaching trillionaires, then you have the impoverishment of the planet. And that's what you have now. So cooperative economics was being stressed, and the mentality that produces that. So that's the ideal form of economic development. Last week, we were privileged to have one of my former students on the show, Brother Alton Wrench, who is a master in both computer technology and business development. And as you saw, the people who watched that show, he's put his own money up to finance a high-end upscale coffee and tea shop operating in the Bayview Hunters Point. And the reason we did that show was to do something practical to get people to see some businesses that are really operating in the interest of the Black community, where they are and what they're doing. And in the case of Alton and his high-end upscale coffee and tea shop, Talio's, as he calls it, he has a plan for setting these up around the country. And this is an important concept in economic development. While something like 96, 97% of Black businesses are owned by a single person, and there's a reason for that. Most Blacks can't get the financing to really expand or build a large enough business that can also grow. And so basically these businesses ended up supporting the person who started them, which is good because that is providing a service to the community at the same time, putting a roof over families' head and food on their table. And very often these owners of single person proprietorships, they often have a job that's giving them the money to support these businesses. And then some are able to generate enough income where they don't have to have a second job. And that's literally what Brother Alton is doing. He's gone into his pocket and set this high-end coffee tea shop up in the Hunters Point. And the other reason I had him on is he's providing good wages for his employees, starting off at $19, getting into $20. His manager's making $30 an hour. And that's coming out of his pocket. Now, he's generating a profit, but I know how businesses go. In their first couple of years, you're doing good to break even. And then, like a lot of marriages, a lot of them fail in the first or second year. 50% of all marriages in this country fail in the first year. And a lot of businesses follow that same course. So you have to have some courage to do this as well as vision. And we're living in a period that I characterize, God told me at least, is a choice between two cultures. And where our people are put in a position of choosing between their culture or this alien European oppressive culture, often not conscious that they're making cultural choices. So one reason for looking at economic development is that it's one of the most positive choices we can make. And since the only people that support Black businesses are Black people, with few exceptions, we're the only economy that only has one market to rely on because no one else supports Black businesses except a handful of other people, whereas all other businesses get support from other groups, whether it's Latinos, Asians, or anyone else. So as much as we put our people down for not being as supportive of Black businesses as we should be, we're the only supporters, and we just need to up our support. But the reason for stressing economic development is that it is one of the main ways we can strengthen Black families, along with good jobs, and put our men in a better position where they can make a financial contribution that's sufficient to the family. So we've discussed this deindustrialization before and how it's taken jobs, good paying jobs, out of the Black community. So this is one way that we build up our communities economically. So this is an important thing, and it's an important thing that we need to support Blacks who are doing business in the Black community. Before going into this show, I also again want to encourage viewers to subscribe, those that haven't. This is a long haul for me. I'm not getting the love from certain things that go down. They got nothing to do with Black people. That slows down my subscriptions, my subscribers. So we've got people like Brother Ugawa and you helping us to up it, but we need to up it. I mean, if I was your oatmeal person on here talking trash, I'd have 10 times the viewers I have, not because we don't have conscious viewers out there, but the algorithms shift for that type. So I understand the game, and I'm in here for the long haul, but my purpose for being here is to reach as many people as I can, especially young Black folks. But any age group is good for me, and any people. I'm out open to sharing my message with everybody, because as you recall in the shows that I've done before, I have an intro to this show that I haven't used for the live shows. I'm not an OG. There's nothing original about gangsterism. I'm an OR. I'm an original revolutionary. So that's another reason why some of you might like it, but there's some others that don't. And I've always told my wife, don't care 2 cents about what someone thinks about you if you're doing right. Later for the popularity contest. It's nice to be popular, but it's much better to be truthful. So I've made a commitment to this show, and people are responding, and I enjoy this. But it is work, and it's more rewarding the more people we get. But what's real rewarding is the conscious viewership that we have right now, and the responses that I'm getting, the insights I'm getting, what I'm learning. So I'm hanging in here. If you haven't noticed, I've been in the Black Liberation Movement 61 years, a scholar 58. So the long haul is normal for me. I was never a fast runner, but if I was, I would be a distance runner. I could never win a race. So I know that I'm not built for speed. If you see my legs, they're muscular and heavy. They're not the kind of legs that a runner has. They're suited for the distance and for battles. I used to do Taekwondo, and that's kicking karate. I don't do that anymore. I do gung fu or gung fu, choli foot. It's different stuff, different stuff for different times. So I'm enjoying this. I hope you are. I hope you're getting something out of this. I also want to encourage people to subscribe to the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom webinar. And because this is a new show, it's taken me time to promote this, but we're getting people who are expressing an interest. This will be a year-long webinar. And this is one of the main reasons that I'm doing this show, is it gives me the opportunity to get into people's consciousness and to help to tweak it. Wherever you are, help you go to the next level. And this is both political and spiritual, historical and psychological, consciousness and transformation. And so that is another reason, a main reason for doing this show. So you'll see today with the topic that I have today that the sixfold stages for mental freedom is like the curative. It's the ultimate healer. I know because I've gone through it. I'm a practice person, not a theory person. Theory is a guess. Practice is what works. And then I'm the person of the light, and that God's been kind enough to share with me some beautiful light, and that's my best stuff. The stuff that comes from God. I can't take credit for it. I'm thankful that God was kind enough to share this with me, to answer questions that I couldn't answer on my own, and then help you in the same way. So the sixfold stages for mental freedom is the ultimate system for freedom and for healing. And it is a transformational system that enhances and promotes self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love. These are the keys for all human beings for peace and mental and spiritual freedom. So today's show, you could consider today's show as part 3 of the series that we dealt with on trauma, stress, and low self-esteem with Sisters Brianna Moore, who's a graduate of San Francisco State University and took courses in Black Studies at that time and now Africana Studies, and Gloria Thomas, my former student at San Francisco State, who took courses in Africana Studies. And both of these, as you recall, are beautiful ladies who have gone through the trials of life, went through the drug addiction and alcohol thing, but didn't stay in long because they had these powerful, loving families and they had strength in their own spirit. And when they got out, they both moved into social work to promote healing in the community. And they've done great work. And if you saw that show, in fact, both of them, because Brianna was on one and then both of them were on the other, and they're both best friends, you saw a lot of insight, but essentially coming from people who practice what they preach. And that's what I like most about our people is their character. And these are people with beautiful characters. So today's show is going to go to the source of inner pain, addressing ultimate healing solutions. So the title for today's show is The Black Liberation Movements, an Active Culture, and the Ultimate Healers of Trauma, Stress, and Low Self-Esteem. Let me repeat that. The title for this show today is The Black Liberation Movements, an Active Culture, and the Ultimate Healer of Trauma, Stress, and Low Self-Esteem. And I should add, the opener to the door of freedom. Now, I want to give credit to a brother named Kweli Tudashinda, who's a chiropractor, Black chiropractor, and his business is in Berkeley. He lives in Oakland. And we were working out together in the Y Monday. We had a conversation, and then this topic came up. He raised it. And I said, oh, yeah, that's a topic. And then I told him when I was leaving upstairs to go downstairs and work out, I says, hey, brother, thank you. You gave me the topic for the show. And then we were talking yesterday on other stuff. So never know where you're going to get a topic from. And this one just hit me right where I needed to be hit. I said, you know what I mean? So I also want to stress, while this show is focusing on the Black liberation movement as an active culture and the ultimate healer of these various afflictions that afflict us, it's a sixfold stages to mental freedom that is the pathway to this process of mental spiritual freedom. So I really want to get this, because I'm not going to go into the sixfold stages today, but I'm going to say that is the ultimate experience, and it is the roadway to the healing. And that's not to dismiss what we've discussed before, because what was discussed before on the healing for trauma and stress and all the other things, the pain that hit our people, these are professional people giving you professional help that a lot of our people need. And so I'm not dismissing that. I'm not saying that this is all you need, what I'm going to present. No, I had made this point before. Sixfold stages to mental freedom is the ultimate healing path, but there's also some professional, technical stuff that we often need. And these two ladies were giving you some of it. And some of that has to do with psychological stuff and a whole lot of other things. So, but this, when I say ultimate, this is the high ground, baby. You hear me? This is the bad stuff. But you see, it takes you out of the Eurocentric or Aryan mindset where this can just be resolved through sitting and quoting. It requires doing. You know what I mean? As some of the hip hoppers say, you free the mind, and I say the behind will follow. Actually, the president of Funkadelic said your ass will follow. I used like to clean it up. Your behind will follow. But the fact of the matter is it takes work. And since most of us are doing a lot of work we don't like, that we call the slave, and some of us that we like, because we've been fortunate enough to pick something that meets our gifts. So there's a lot of unpleasant work that you do to put food on your table. So this is work that may be hard, but it produces good results. So in saying that the ultimate system for healing and freedom comes through liberation movements that are expressions of culture, I don't want people to think that I'm just talking about the collective big movements, because included in this category of movements for personal change and transformation are personal acts of resistance. First, because liberation movements are made up of nothing but individual people, and each have their own personal experience that comes out of that movement and contributes to that movement. And it's the combination of the participation of the people as a whole that bring the power and creativity to a movement. If the people don't move, nothing happens. So there's one level in which the collective movement is an expression of the person or the individual because it's made up of individuals. But then there's another level where resistance is personal. That is where individuals have to stand up and take stands on their lonely, battles on their own. These may be battles on the job. These may be battles against oppressive forces, the police or whatever it is. You know what I mean? And so it's in the course of those battles also that people come alive and can experience some of this ultimate healing, especially when the battles have something to do with a cause that's greater than you. That is, if some cop is messing with you and you're going to have to do something about that, then that cause isn't just your life. That cause is something greater than you, because that same policeman is messing with somebody else. And if you're able to do something about it, you might be able to mitigate it or something else. But it's in that process that change is going to occur in your own life. So personal acts, standalone acts of resistance, can have a healing and empowering effect on the fighter, just as it does on people in collective movements where people are engaged in movements for change collectively. And this is a key point, people who are engaged in personal acts of resistance can undergo transformation that then encourages them to engage in a broader struggle. Sometimes it's the collective struggle, like in my case, that triggers the personal transformation. And in other cases, it can be the personal struggle that enables the person to gain the self-confidence and the courage to participate in something bigger than themselves. In some cases, you have people, for example, there's this book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, on the Mississippi freedom struggle. And in there, they talk about families that were engaged in struggle. And one was the McGee family in Mississippi, a little sister who was the mother, who was tough as they can get, and her husband before that, who was a fighter, and then her children, young men, who were the bravest people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi. Vanetta McGee was so bad that when one of her sons was locked up, she told the cops, this is in Mississippi now, to let her in the room, and he didn't. She punched him, and the person watching it said he never saw a person form a bruise before they hit the ground, and she kept punching him. Now, she got away with that because she was a woman, and they were embarrassed. They didn't want to admit that a woman had beat them up. You know what I mean? But she's an example of somebody that was waging her personal war before the Black freedom movement ever came to Mississippi. So you have Black folks who just have fight in them, and they usually make up the foundation of any movement, you know. And very often there's family tradition there, but sometimes it just happens to be in them. My father was like that, waging a personal war when there was no army, there was no Black freedom movement, there was no Black power movement. He was the Black freedom movement, his bare knuckles, and later brass knuckles, when he had to take on people who were too big for him. Then he equalized it, even Stephen, and they didn't know what hit him either. He'd hit them so fast, they'd hit the ground so fast, he'd cover up those brass knuckles so that the guy's 6'2", double his weight and everything else, wouldn't know that it wasn't by fair means. And since when have they been fair? So, you know, we've always had people like this, but the key point is this transformation of consciousness that represents the ultimate healing can come through the individual who's waging their battle, or through the group, or a combination of these. I also want to make a qualification. While participating in a liberation movement, whether in the beginning you're the movement or in a larger movement, can be the ultimate healer, it doesn't mean every involvement in a movement is going to produce that, because some movements goof up. Sometimes leaders go astray. Sometimes movements get beaten down. And even in the pit, you can gain mother wit. So what do you learn from that? But some people learn to be ashamed of that struggle. It creates trauma. So I'm not romanticizing this. As somebody who's been through a lot of movements, lost no battles, I can say that losing doesn't exactly help when it comes to ultimate healing, but it can, because it's a matter of what you learn. Because you can face a setback. A boxer can lose a fight, but then what do they learn from that? They may get back in the ring and knock the same guy out that had knocked them out before. Maybe sometimes they hit the ring too soon, so they go and get ready. So just because you have setbacks doesn't mean that these aren't learning experiences. In fact, your best learning experiences come from setbacks. But I'm just not going to present a rosy picture of, oh, the Black Liberation Movement, blah, blah. You're awake. It's also what kind of work do you do in the participation in that movement? What do you learn from it? King wasn't as brilliant an intellect as Malcolm when it came to analysis, but King was smart. He got into college, I think, when he was very young, 15 or 16 years old. But he was a person who was sincere, and he learned from the movements that he took part in. He learned, and he, as a result, grew because his intentions were good. He was following the truth. And I think that's the key to anything. Follow the truth, your truth, which is why you're here, your purpose in life, and then the truths you're seeking. And that's the most valuable thing you'll get out of any movement is the truth. And there's always more to learn. You never know enough. And the two truths are from your people and from your enemy. Some of your best teachings will come from your people, everyday Black folks, and some highly evolved, and from your enemy. And don't think that because your enemy is this boogeyman or whatever you call him, or this system of systemic racism or the big C that most people don't like to deal with, capitalism and imperialism. This is the system that's oppressing the world. Don't think that because they're bleeding misery all over the planet, there's nothing to learn from them. Know your enemy. And there's a lot you can learn from your enemy. And sometimes some of the methods they're using against you, you're going to have to master them. It doesn't mean you're reacting. It doesn't mean you're becoming like them. But if they got certain things that work and it generally produces power, then you're going to have to look at that. You know what I mean? So the world's a classroom. The battlefield is the best classroom. Your people and the enemy. Better than all the books you read, and you need to read. Because in the battlefield, it's hard to hit the books, but you better hit the books. But the best books is engagement. You hear me? So there's a key reason why the liberation movement, in this case, the Black liberation movement, is the ultimate healer to the various pain that people in general and Black people in particular go through, whether it's trauma, low self-esteem, and all the other things. Impoverishment, in this case, we're talking about material impoverishment, miseducation, a whole host of things. There is a primary reason why the Black liberation movement or any other liberation movement for people of color is the ultimate healer of all of these indicators of oppression. The main reason is that what we see as the imbalances, the pain, and everything else is caused by an imbalance of power. It is the fact that your oppressor was able to get the best of you and put you and us in the position we're in. So power, in this case, unjust power, is a source of all of these problems we're talking about. You know, this issue of stress, power relationships. And if you're in a situation where you're not in control of your life, then you feel unempowered and it's stressful. But that's caused by imbalance of power, which is itself the basis for oppression. And so we have brave people, but we got conquered. And so we got put into this enslavement and colonial situation. And now neo-colonialism, where in Africa you're being controlled indirectly through the dollar. Malcolm called it dollarism. Or here I call it semi-colonialism. Elements of what you have in colonialism, your community being occupied by the police, force and violence used against you, control of your economy and everything else coming from the larger, more powerful white economic forces. And so I call that semi. It's got elements of colonialism. So these all have to do with power dynamics, ultimately. So if the cause for oppression is the greater power possessed by the oppressor, then the basis for ultimate freedom is the accumulation of power that enables you to fight the oppressor, ultimately to overcome him. But this isn't an ultimate thing in the beginning, meaning um, you don't get healed just only when you have completely defeated your opponent. No, because struggles go through stages. It's like life, cycles. It's like history, cycles. And so the ultimate healing system goes through stages. And in the United States, where we're up against the biggest power structure that is in decline in the world, this is a long term struggle. I was talking about I'm not a runner. In one of my first shows, I made the point that I tried out for track in junior high school. Horseman Junior High School was in the Mexican American community. And I had my cleats on, I had my little shorts on, Jesse Owens, and started. It was a 50-yard dash and started the run. I was ahead. In the end, I was dead last. And then I concluded, oh, you don't have speed, forget it. You know what I mean? But our race, this race for Black liberation, is a marathon. This is not a 50-yard or 75-yard or 100-yard dash. It's a marathon, and it's a relay race. It's like a relay race where you got to pass the baton on. It's not just one person running. And so it's an intergenerational race. And so it's what we do to contribute to this race, to speed it up, to get us closer to where we're going for liberation. And I want to stress, a lot of us aren't clear on what that is. We've talked about it before. At times we'll go into this in great detail, but I think the conclusions of King and Malcolm, the conclusions of where our struggle has gone and where it's going, it clearly is. And given the demographic shifts in this country, the decline of American power in the world with the rise of China, and later it will be Africa, with the numerical decline of whites in this country and the oppressive nature of this country, restructuring is the name of the game here. That means taking something crooked and making it straight. And that's basically what I'm doing. I'm putting forward systems for now that can improve your lives right now, like the sixfold stages to mental freedom, like my book on the return to the African mother principle of male and female equality that comes from God, that gives you the formula for just societies, which is twin lineal families, not patriarchal, where men rule, or matriarchal, where women rule, but twin lineal, where men and women rule in balance. And that comes from over 140,000 years of history. I'm the only scholar in the world that has uncovered that. And when I build up enough viewership, I'm going to go into it. This is too important to be dealing with right now, but I am going to be going into it because I never adequately promoted this book. My book sold as well as Marimbani's over a longer period of time. Her book is Yurugu, which deals with the unjust society, mine, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, deals with the just society. I'm going to have her on the show. I really like her. She comes out of SNCC, was married to Bob Moses. Her name then was Donna Richards, and I come out of C.O.R.E. And she's a female dealing with the unjust male-based society, Yurugu, the man minus the feminine principle, and me, I'm dealing with the masculine feminine, what I call the twin lineal principle. And she taught at Hunter University, where John Henry Clark chaired Black Studies, encouraged her, in fact, to do her PhD dissertation, which was Yurugu. And of course, John Henry Clark, I apprenticed under him as well. So I'm a systems person. It's not the way I approach things. It's what it ends up being, because I'm a revolutionary. So I'm putting forward systems that are replacements for this one. And unlike the Marxists, it does not depend on the thing falling apart. That is, this system that oppresses us falling apart to use it. You can use it right now. And that is really the test for anything. You work out whatever doesn't work in a system to make it work better. And so this twin lineal family paradigm is like the salvation for our people. So um, when we look at power relationships, the act of resistance, whether personal or collective, against the oppressive system, this semi-colonial, systemic, racist, capitalist system, um, that it is in the engagement in that struggle, both on a personal and a collective level, that we are able to achieve ultimate healing and a true spiritual and mental freedom, because we're engaged in a process where power meets power. And whether it's on an individual or collective level, it's a part of this long-term race. Whereas we pick up the baton from one generation to the other, we're empowering each other to move to higher and higher levels. And the key to this empowerment is the culture of your people, because liberation movements are acts of culture. And we're often not conscious of just how much the movements we're engaged in are expressions of our culture. And to go back to the point that not all liberation movements will, in every case, promote healing, they usually will if the movements are aspiring to the higher principles of our culture and to the higher cause, which is the freedom of our people. And if our leaders don't get caught up in materialism and corruption, and even if they do, the people can always push them aside and move on. So this is the key thing about this ultimate healing system. It comes out of struggle. And I really want to stress the sixfold stages to mental freedom. That's not some theory formulated in some ivory tower. Bulunlela Wabogo and I, when we tracked this, he was tracking Frantz Fanon's description of stages of awakening. He made more of what Fanon said than Fanon did, which is a contribution of Bulunlela Wabogo. And me, I was tracking my own awakening because I had gone through this. And then I was looking at other people who had gone through it, because basically one of the ways I shape stuff is through practice. I don't put out stuff unless it works. And so the sixfold stages for mental freedom is really tracking the transformation that occurs through struggle. That's why ultimately you won't get it if you just think you're quoting something. You got to be this. That's the key. And to do that, you got to get up off your behind and do something. And I know some of you are. Some of you are sending me some quite beautiful pictures of some of the stuff you're doing around resistance work. I say, oh, this is pretty good. You hear me? Pretty good. uh-huh. And sending me some material to read. I'm saying, oh, well. So this isn't just true for Africans in the U.S. that we're in a relay race, but it's also true of Africans in the Caribbean, South America, Africa, Africans in Europe. Because in the case of the Caribbean and in Africa, the people are still in the stage of neo-colonialism. They have flag independence, they have their presidents, they have their own governments, but the strings are being pulled from the outside. Malcolm, as I said before, called that dollarism. And so very often governments are pursuing policies not in the interest of their people, because other outside forces are controlling them. Again, I want to compliment the government of Barbados. I was just reading something, and my wife, who's from Barbados, was explaining it to me. Barbados has for a long time had a supplementary income program where people below a certain income get a supplement from the government to raise up their income, because basically the economy of Barbados is tourism and banking. And now they're trying to get into some other areas that can enhance economic development. And so now Prime Minister Motley, who is one bad sister, bad is good, and don't misinterpret what I'm saying, she just received an award from the United Nations for her leadership. She's now upping the government contribution to this supplementary income. In the United States, you should have a guaranteed annual income, because if you're making $20,000 a year, it'd be hard for a dog to live on that income. Definitely a human being. That's hardly rent. In fact, out here, you can't pay the rent on $20,000 a year, because the average little apartment here in Oakland is $2,500, 2-bedroom, whatever. Do the math on that. That's well beyond $20,000. That's closer to 30, you know? So just as the corporations get the government to give them everything and make them rich, like the internet, that was the military that came up with the internet technology. Now you got all these rich white boys running around acting like they're geniuses, but the government gave that to them. That's affirmative action. The railroads were given to big business during the Civil War, and they got the rights to everything that goes underneath the railroads, all the raw materials. Read the book Robber Barons that describes this. So there's been affirmative action through genocide, through enslavement, through land expropriation, that is stealing half of Mexico. You know, why shouldn't you get some? So you can bring your income up to 70 or 80,000 a year, and it would take very little to do that. What it will take is some real power, and that to me is not revolutionary, by the way. That's enabling people to exist in a way in which they can enjoy life. Now, of course, it's not in my interest to say that, because revolutions are promoted by hardship, but I don't want to see hardship on our people. So I'm somebody that believes that reform's a mother revolution. Get all the reforms you can to improve your condition, but understand in the end, that ain't going to be enough. But that is something that needs to happen. So it's in the participation in this movement for change where power dynamics change. And in the course of that, you can undergo a change, whether it's individually or collectively, whether it's in the United States and the Caribbean, Africa, or Europe, or wherever our people are in the world. And this applies to people of color, wherever they are. So each generation has to discover its destiny and either fulfill it or betray it, just as each person has to discover their destiny and fulfill it or betray it. And we can't always fulfill our destiny under a system of oppression. So I'm not putting down Black people who had some dream to do something and couldn't because the system blocked it. That happens. So that ain't a person's fault. It is when you have the chance and don't. And then I'm not putting that person down, because you confine yourself to misery. That was your choice, very often caused by low self-esteem or other things. So part of this question of healing, ultimate healing, has to do with our pursuit of our destiny as a group of people and individually, because each of us have our own special gifts. That series that we did on God within, we went through the Ka, which is your destiny, or Ori, or Kra, or Chi, all meaning destiny. That you picked in heaven, that which inside of you makes you most happy when you're doing it. That it arises from your gifts, and pursuing those are the greatest joy in life. And I can say that's been my greatest joy. All the things I do are things I love doing, like this right here. I'm a disseminator. My moon is in Pisces, my sun is in Leo. Some of y'all ain't into astrology. I understand. But the alignment of planets, in this case, the sun and the moon, basically is the structure of the person. John Coltrane had sun opposed moon, sun in Libra, moon in Aries. What does that mean? Greatest illumination when the moon is full. So it usually means a person that has this alignment, that person is going to have masculine, feminine, if it's a male, feminine issues, that is with women in their lives, and a female, masculine issues. But more important, it means that they're going to have to struggle to gain clarity over whatever their life mission is. And if they're able to achieve that, they can become great creators. Coltrane, an average musician, struggles in his first marriage with Naima, a lovely lady, but they had to separate. And then he finds his second wife, and Alice Coltrane, who was a musician, played the harp. He brought her a beautiful harp. They were in harmony with each other. They started having babies after he married her. And he had an alcohol problem, but when he got over it, and a drug problem, when he got over it, he cold turkey. He had a dream after 2 weeks. He said he heard a sound. It was heavenly. That was a love supreme. He had been an average, ordinary musician with only the talent of rhythm. He ascended through this apprenticeship system that Africans and African Americans have, and through hard work. And because of his destiny, his gift to be creative, which he could only achieve through hard work, he became one of the greatest musical innovators in the history of the planet Earth, John Coltrane. And his best recording, A Love Supreme, was his longest, because that man could play for an hour and a half, and bring nothing but beauty. But the point is, he was doing his thing. He was fulfilling his destiny. And that's where his joy came from. Me, my moon is in Pisces, my sun is in Leo. What does that mean? I'm coming the day after the full moon. The day after the full moon is the sharing phase. You've had enlightenment, you want to share it. That's called the disseminator. So part of what I'm doing, that's what I do. But I'm not trying to disseminate just stuff people already know. I'm trying to come up with new stuff that will help people. So knowing your gifts and pursuing your destiny is the essence of joy. It's the essence of happiness and fulfillment. And it doesn't mean that it has to be you having the job that you want. It is the mission that you're on, and it's the gifts that you have to fulfill that mission. And most of us have many gifts, multidimensional, and they usually work together. And so if you're able to pursue those gifts, and that's your choice, that's your choice. But you have obstacles in the way. But you can't approach this as, oh, I can't do it because they won't let me. You got to have my mother's attitude. When they told her she can't, she said, oh, yes, I can. You know what I mean? That was my mother. You got to have that kind of attitude. Or if you go the other way, when you find the misery there, then correct, your movement and go forward, however it works. So the choices that we make are really key, and particularly in the pursuit of freedom and liberation. The choices we make are always linked, when they're correct, to our culture. And in the era of a choice between two cultures, where our people are put in the position of being pushed outside their culture, then they have to be very clear. We all have to be very clear about who we are so we can make corrections. So if we go off in the wrong way, like drugs will take us off in the wrong way, we can correct the course. But that's the obvious one, drugs. They were put in here to take you off course. But generally, the globalized corporate culture, they're designed to take you off course by sinking in your head alien values, mainly materialism, individualism, don't care about anybody but yourself. And when you get caught in that trap, then you are truly intellectually incarcerated, truly in the plantation syndrome. So when we talk about the liberation movement, whether personal resistance or collective resistance is the ultimate source of healing, it is a process where we've got to make the right cultural choices, because generally when we experience true freedom, freedom of the mind and spirit, our culture is all up in it. It's what gives us the inspiration to stand up and do what we have to do to achieve freedom of the mind and spirit, and ultimately of the body and of society. So what I'm going to do is show how liberation movements and personal resistance, the individual resisting personally, act as a healing force, in this case, against enslavement in the United States, with application to today. And since we trace a lot of our pain to that, and now the post-60s crisis, I thought it was appropriate to do a little look at that, because that is where some real serious trauma occurred, real serious pain occurred. But it's also where some real serious power was achieved. So our people's personal resistance and collective resistance to enslavement had a historical and cultural context, just as our resistance today has a historical, political, cultural, social context. And it really shapes how people saw things and how they tended to resist collectively and were inspired to resist individually. And so understanding that context is very important. Don't put your situation, the situation we're living in now, and assume that our people 200-300 years ago were living with that same psychological setup. The first thing to remember about those enslaved Africans is they were either straight up Africans, saltwater, came off the boat, or they were the closest to Africa of any of our people. And just as a little side note, I've been telling you, I've been reading this book on the Haitian Revolution, Black Spartacus. It's focusing on Toussaint Louverture. And it's very important to note that what most of our people don't realize is, because some of us have bought into the idea that the Haitian people have broken consciousness and stuff, that's an error. First of all, if so, how were they the only people in the world to destroy slavery? But more important, the majority of the people who took part in the Haitian Revolution were straight from Africa. The majority, straight from Africa. You hear that? So unless Africa was completely broken down, then they came in here with some certain qualities. And you had two categories: those who were enslaved through various ways, and those who were captured as prisoners of war. Those who came as prisoners of war were straight up warriors and fighters. And those who were captured, most of them were over 18. I pointed this out before. They had been initiated into secret societies, and as males were trained as warriors, and as females, they were trained to be tough. These were the toughest training grounds you could have. They weren't designed to prepare you for slavery, but people who had gone through them, and virtually all of these Africans did, they're about the toughest and nicest human beings on the planet Earth. And one reason why the Haitians did what they did is that they had this spirit of Africa up inside of them. You do too. But the thing is, it's these older Africans in enslavement that were the most African among us. But we have this pity pot attitude about them. That ain't who they were. Study their stuff. You know what I mean? So our people's personal and collective resistance has a historical and cultural, political and social context that they acted out of, which was their act of culture. In the case of the United States, the savagery of plantation slavery had a central purpose: to break the African, break them. And some of us have bought into this idea. They broke us. Oh, they would talk about Barbados was the breaking in center. And then suddenly we're nice people and brought to America. Oh, really? First of all, they were breaking us in a place where you shouldn't have been able to have a rebellion, because that land is flat. The native Arawak people, the native people of Haiti, of Barbados, they left Barbados because they couldn't defend that flat country. But there were two major rebellions among the Barbadians designed to, restore power to what they called the Asantehene. In other words, a strong group of Barbadians come from Ghana. They're Asante people. And they nearly pulled it off because they had the numbers to. And what that's telling you is that the country that's supposed to be breaking people in, they were facing some of the fiercest resistance that you found. But that resistance was all over the Caribbean, South America, and especially the United States. And why was that? Because the effort of the enslaver to break us aroused in the enslaved the determination to rise up and beat this barbaric system that oppressed them by any means necessary, and they employed every means at their disposal. This was true of enslaved Africans throughout the Caribbean and South America as well. So the stiffer the effort to break, the stiffer the resistance to it. That's not the picture you normally get, but read the slave narratives. Listen to the spirituals. Read the history that is often recorded in the writings of enslaved Africans. One that I'm going to be referring to today. You always get some books from me. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. But there's a whole bunch of these. Zora Neale Hurston, one of her books that was recently published was, I forget the exact title, but it was The Last African. It's talking about one of the last ones brought from Africa to the United States during the era of the Civil War, you know. And so if you check these Africans out, you're going to see that they had a certain mentality. Africans in the United States and the Western Hemisphere put up fierce, determined resistance. Contrary to the mythology that passes off as history, white and black, because we have some blacks who have bought into this as well. Most blacks didn't buy into the myth of us being savages. But some did buy into the myth of docility and servility and the myth that Christianity tamed us. And that's what the nationalists believe. That's why Lao Tzu asked me for the source on my statement that most Africans in enslavement weren't Christians. Why would they be? They're spirit people. God's up in everything with them. First of all, they don't need a religion because Africans ain't into religion. This notion that comes from the Romans to bind together Christianity and what they call paganism, which is an insulting term, means people other than Christians, you know. We're not people of the book. And don't say, yes, we are because of the Confessions of Innocence. That's not the book. Meaning, it's not a book that lays down laws. Africans need no laws. We don't go to a book to tell us to be right. It's in us. We know that. You know what I mean? And so Africans come here with a deep sense of spirit, a deep sense of humanity, a deep sense of freedom. You hear me? And so why are we going to embrace somebody's religion who is practicing one thing or practicing one thing and saying another? And then treating enslavement as ordained by God and telling you to follow the Pauline epistles. That was the one thing all Africans, the few who are Christian and the majority who were not, rejected, which is the passage in the Bible that says, slave, obey your master. And when they sent those old white preachers to black people on the plantation, and they said that, the Africans would laugh. They wouldn't laugh in their face, but afterwards, they would laugh. And they would say, God didn't say that, because they know God didn't justify oppression. So the African came in with a moral compass that the white boy couldn't even conceive of. But it was a moral compass they lived. And so their resistance was inspired by their own spirit beliefs, their own sense of humanity. Most enslaved Africans were young. One reason is that the European preferred those who were optimistic and making them less likely to die of grief. They didn't know that they were optimistic. They just knew that they were younger and therefore they're likely not to grieve the way older people did. What they didn't understand is they're willing to fight on many different levels. So instead of these Africans, these young Africans grieving, they gave their masters grief. This ain't what you normally get in the history books. But you see, who wrote most of those history books? The enslaved African was younger than the enslaver. So that meant also the energy, the courage, and not all of that, which the enslaved Africans, I made this point before, they referred to the African coming from Africa as possessing African courage. That was just taken for granted. You hear me? Because they came from societies of freedom and they were fearless. So all of this means that the climate, the cultural climate that affected the African was a climate of resistance. It was a climate that was totally non-compromising. And one of the things that they were most non-compromising on was this idea that they would be a slave for life. The other one was the idea that someone could be their master. To the extent that they believed in mastership at all, they believed that God was the master. But they didn't have the idea of God being the master that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism have. Because they believed in destiny. And they believed that they picked their course and lot in life, and it wasn't slavery. And they believed this was a temporary experience, one that they had to overcome. That was inherent in them. So they rejected the idea of being a slave. This is a key thing to get. And the favorite song of the enslaved, and it was, by the way, the favorite song of the Black Freedom Movement. When we marched or we were in jail, this was the main national anthem of the movement. Oh, freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was the mantra of the everyday African. It could be the biggest, baddest, boldest one. It could be the oldest one. It could be the youngest one. That was the general attitude. You hear me? These are Africans coming from societies in which nobody dictated to them. Even when they had kings, the kings, they were picked based usually on their qualities, royal qualities of goodness, bravery, honesty, trustworthiness, respect for the people that never cursed. These are the people that they picked. You know what I mean? And they were bound by their councils. They didn't make decisions like they did in Europe on their own. And the average African, to this day, that includes our people now, they reject anybody imposing their orders on them. That's why it was so hard to organize. And that's a good thing. Because if you get a group together, it should be nobody up there dictating. The people should have the ultimate say-so. So this idea embodied in this song, before I'll be a slave. I've talked about this before. That sounds like somebody that wasn't a slave. It definitely was somebody who rejected the notion that mind and spirit could be enslaved and rejected the idea of physical slavery, even though they were caught up in it. So this is the idea that was also expressing the fact that we aspire to being the masters of ourselves because we also had God-given destinies to be creative human beings. And the greatest yearning for our people was to be free so we could express those creative gifts that we have. And what we did in the course of enslavement is create a culture and an art form right under their nose so that we could do that. create beauty in the environment of ugliness. That's what we did and continue to do. So the rebellious nature of the enslaved African was such as it went like this. You want to understand, because we're talking about how the liberation movement, both collective and personal, is the ultimate healer. Then understand how the enslaved responded to the orders of the master, because they didn't see themselves as slaves. So when old master said that you better not read, because they figured that a reading slave would be somebody who could know something. They didn't want them reading the Bible. That's another reason why most of us weren't Christian. They didn't even want you either, you know what I mean, in that Bible. But what would happen? We'd sneak off and learn how to read. Now, not everybody did because they couldn't, but a whole lot did. You hear me? They learned by hook and crook, getting them a newspaper, a scrap of newspaper, and tracing over it, getting somebody that knew how to teach them or whatever, usually in silence and quiet. Sometimes a master would, so-called master would teach that enslaved person until their husband or wife found out and intervened and stopped it. But what, hook or crook, we defied it. That was the idea of defiance. If they said that enslaved couldn't congregate beyond a certain number, no more than 2, we congregated in numbers. When the white boy was asleep or so far away he couldn't hear us, but at great risk, because if we got caught, it was going to be some severe punishment. But that was the rebellious nature of the enslaved African. And of course, if you got a workload, sometimes you break the hoe. Sometimes the poor animal got hurt. You know what I mean? But it was going to cut down on the work. Or Ella Baker's great aunt, she got distracted, meaning at a certain time when she's out in the field, she'd act crazy. She didn't have to work anymore. You understand? Or white boy would say, you can't be praising God in a group, because after the Nat Turner rebellion, then all they wanted was white preachers on the plantation, which black people went to sleep listening to them. And so what would black people do? Steal away into a remote area, a forest or a cabin furthest removed from the white boy, put our heads under a bucket and bring down the spirit. You hear me? We'd praise God. Those are called hush harbors. Or sometimes what would happen with Africans, particularly in Haiti, Jamaica, places like that, certain parts of the United States, like the swamps in Louisiana, we would then not just steal away, but we would escape to those areas and form maroon communities that operated on African principles. And in the Caribbean, usually straight up kingship principles and stuff like that. And so the Jamaicans, their maroons, were able to establish free communities. And of course, Haiti, the maroon resistance tradition, where you went to the mountains and, lived an African life, that was part of the reason for the success of the Haitian Revolution. Read Jacob Carruthers' book on the Haitian Revolution. So the ultimate act of resistance, the highest expression of African and New African culture in the United States, whether it was collectively or individually, were acts of either physical rebellion or of slave rebellions. And of course, petty maroonage, which is running away, which nearly broke the back of slavery because so many blacks ran away. All of these were acts of culture. They indicated a resilience among our people that no matter how down we may have felt, we could make the effort to get up and move on. And the cultural qualities of our people during enslavement, the ultimate ones were the qualities of transcendence, that is, rising above a situation, no matter how bad it was. And this again had to do with us forging a new African culture here and the continuation of African culture in the Caribbean and South America. Now, what I want to do is use Frederick Douglass as an example of this, because I think that he provides some very good examples of this resilience and resistance. He also provides some very good examples of going to the lowest point that a human being could go and then rising above it. Douglass' worst experience in enslavement was when he faced the slave breaker, C.O.R.E, C-O-V-E-Y. And the brutality of C.O.R.E was such that it put Frederick Douglass in the worst state, mental, psychological, spiritual, in his life, because C.O.R.E worked him to death and beat him nearly to death. And that was the nature of this man. Frederick Douglass had been leased out like you lease out a chicken, a cattle or whatever, for a period of time to C.O.R.E by his so-called slave master. And so Frederick Douglass described this experience with C.O.R.E as an experience of brokenness. He felt broken. And one of the early viewers in this show made that comment that she had felt broken, meaning in this society today, some of these same forces are trying to do the same thing to us as a people. So he described his circumstance, and this is about as bad as it gets. And most Africans didn't reach this level, but some did. Many who did could rise above it, and some didn't. He said, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished." Listen to this. "The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed to a brute." You hear me? This is the brilliant Frederick Douglass that we would know later. But this is the level to which this so-called slave breaker had brought him. So Frederick Douglass sought to avoid C.O.R.E. What he did is he went to the slave master that owned him and had leased him to C.O.R.E and begged him to let him return to him, because ain't nobody wants to be returned to any slave master, but this one here, C.O.R.E was about as bad as it got. And that one that he went to said, "Well, I know you did something wrong and you got to go back," because Frederick was just an investment for him. "I'll let you sleep overnight, but you got to go back the next morning." So going back meant whipping, possibly mutilation, And so he went back. But this is about how the liberation movement, in this case, this is an example of personal resistance, is an active culture. So I really want you to get what Frederick got that gave him a big helping hand. So on his way back, typical of the African, got to understand the cultural climate we were operating then. Typical of the African, he usually didn't make moves unless he got advice from his elders. That's what we always used to do. Some of you ain't doing that anymore. Some of you are running around here talking about you don't need to take these shots, and you're citing all this data that you got on the internet, but all the people dying are the ones that don't have shots. I know some of you don't want to hear this, and I respect you. I'm not going to call you what a lot of people would call you, but I mean, if there was a plot to kill you, you're executing it right now because you ain't listening to elders for the most part. I know those of you that watch this show, yeah, some of you, but a lot of us are not. With these external forces that have led us to choose between two cultures, we're listening to somebody a minute older or younger than us. If we're gangbangers, we're listening to somebody who spent most of his life in jail. They don't even know how to pull off a successful any kind of enterprise, legal or illegal. And so, we're doing stuff that ain't got no common sense. Some of us wearing masks but not taking a shot, and others not wearing a mask and not taking a shot. So, but in those days, we listened to our elders, and I do all the time, and not just my elders. Anytime I got something that I haven't got the answer to, I ask my wife, what do you think? I'll go around and ask different people, what do you think? And then I'll take the best view. And if it's not the one of someone that thought I should take their advice, too bad. I'm going on what I think is best. That's how you make good decisions. That's why I've never lost a battle. I'm a strategist, but I ain't got all the answers. And so in this case, Frederick was smart enough to go back to this vicious, savage Covey. He decided to stop on his way back and visit an old elder by the name of Sandy Jenkins. He was just one of many of the elders that, we've relied on for our growth and development. The institution of elderhood is one of many institutions that survived the Middle Passage in America and made us strong. It's been weakened more by drugs than anything else, but it is still there. For anyone that's got sense, they'll go to somebody who's not talking nonsense. Of course, I listen to nonsense too, because as Coltrane said, he learned from the worst musicians. There was something they could do that he couldn't do. I'm the same way. I got a good ear. I listen. See me running this mouth? I'm a listener, baby. I'm an organizer. I listen. Some of my best decisions, financially, politically, otherwise, have come from other people. And I give credit. I'm not going to say that was my idea. I'll tell the person because he may not have known it. You're the one that gave me that idea. Oh, really? Yeah. So he goes to Sandy and he wants to know what should he do. And then his comment was, this was a compliment. He said, Sandy was an old advisor, meaning a wise advisor. And Sandy was an enslaved African married to a free African woman. He was going at that time to visit her because you had those relationships at that time. And so Sandy took Fred into the forest after giving him some advice. He basically told him, you got to go back, because unless he was prepared to escape, and if he wasn't, he'd probably get caught, then you got no choice. You're going to have to go back. But being a wise elder, he took Frederick into the woods where a certain root grew. Because, see, in these days, we had root doctors. By the way, Toussaint was a root doctor, trained by his father, a root doctor, or herbalist, And so in this forest, a particular root grew, and Sandy picked it, gave it to Frederick, and gave him this advice. He told him to carry this root in the right side of your pocket. And he said that as long as he carried this root on his right side, and I'm quoting what Sandy said, quote, it would render it impossible for Covey or any white man to whip you. You hear me? Now, Mr. Sandy cited as evidence that he had carried this root in the right pocket for years. And since he had carried it, a white man had never delivered a blow to him. and he never expected that one would ever try. Now, of course, Frederick wasn't all that religious. If you know anything about Frederick Douglass, he was spiritual in the sense that he was a good person, probably believed in God, but he wasn't into a lot of the spirit practices of a lot of blacks at that time. So Frederick, like a lot of you, thought, well, hey, Root ain't got no power. They can't do anything for me. You know what I mean? That's what he thought, you know? And so, but Sandy convinced him. He said that it would not do him any harm if it did not do him any good. Now, see, that's a wise elder. He's got you trapped in some good logic there. You know what I mean? What's it going to hurt you? So Fred stuck it in his pocket because he wasn't old then. He was a young man. And he pocketed the root on his right side, made sure it wasn't on the left. Now, that's telling you something. And then he went up to Covey. This was Sunday, when he's supposed to get a whipping. More than that, because he had left the plantation. You know, he had no permission. He didn't have no letter or nothing. You know what I mean? And Covey walked right by. And Fred started to question, well, maybe this root's got something to it. Hey. But then he said, maybe not, because this is Sunday. He's not doing this because this is typical of the worst slave masters. The worst ones were good old Christians. You know what I mean? Most savage going. The first ship to ship us over here. Good ship, Jesus. You know what I mean? Good for what? So he said, it may be different on Monday. So, but it led him to question the power of this root. I think a little something seeped into that mind of Frederick Douglass. A little thing that said, well, maybe there might be something to this. Because remember, he's standing on his own. And this root, if it's got anything, is his company. Some powerful company. Because liberation movements aren't just expressions of physical power. They're expressions of spirit power. That's your culture, baby, for us. So Monday came. Frederick is given some assignments, and he's in the barn doing his assignments. He said he was glad to, meaning avoid being whipped, you know. And then suddenly, Covey comes in with a rope and tries to lasso him so that he could beat him half to death. Too much of a coward to just go and try and do it. He's got to have him tied up and everything. And so these are Frederick Douglass's words. These are the first time he uttered these words in his life. He said, and this is a man who is supposed to be broken. This is a man who had experienced the dregs of slavery. Douglass said, Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, and he would do as he pleased. But at this moment, listen to this. This is the transformative point in his act of resistance. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know. I resolved to fight. First time in his life that he put his life on the line. Of course, it had been on the line all the time because the white boy could take it anytime he wanted to, except that he was a piece of property. He could mess it, but he didn't want to kill it, you know? And so he says, from whence came the spirit? I don't know. Remember, the spirit. Oh, I don't know. I resolved to fight, and suiting my action to the resolution, meaning he was resolved to fight, but he was going to fight in a way to beat him. You hear me? Hardly a broken man, huh? I seized Covey hard by the throat. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken aback. He trembled like a leaf. Oh, cowardly white boy. This gave Frederick Douglass further courage to fight, and that fight went on for 2 hours. The baddest person on the plantation came in. That was a sister. She was the toughest one on that plantation. And this white boy was begging her to help him. She stood there and acted dumb. Another one who had been leased was asked to help him, and he stood back and said, I wasn't hired for that. Now, this is what you call indirection. These slaves wanted to see if Frederick Douglass could whip them, because that's what they wanted to do. The baddest sister on the plantation, I'm sure she wanted to do that and could have. She just didn't want to give up her life. And so this fight lasted for 2 hours. And in the course of that fight, C.O.R.E ended up bleeding, not Frederick. See, this prophecy of the old man, no one's ever going to whip you again, it had come true. So C.O.R.E finally gave up. He ended up saying that, this fight's over because you're tired out. And I beat you and all this kind of stuff. He got whipped. And so this is the healing power of resistance to oppression. Now, hear what Frederick Douglass says about the effect of this lonely individual battle. Hear what he says, because this is why resistance, whether personal or collective, is the greatest healer. Because if all of your neurosis, all of those signs of oppression fall on your head because your enemy has overpowered you, the best way to correct that is to overpower him. And personal engagement is your best shot. I'm not saying to do it. I'm simply saying that's the result of it. I know my father got a lot of satisfaction out of that. You know what I mean? It upped his spirit and the spirit of the household to hear how he knocked this white boy out. Because he had legal right. He was, told you before, a bouncer. So he had the authority to kick somebody's butt and not go to jail. Be a black man. Do it. These are all white people he's kicking. You know what I mean? My father didn't like jail. When I was in jail, he was out there demonstrating for me in front of the county jail. He said, I never thought I'd be proud of my son for going to jail, because that was one of the things my father didn't want to touch, was a jail, you know? So this is what Douglass said about the effect of this encounter. And this was ultimate healing, baby. You hear me? This made Frederick Douglass the man that he became. You think that happened after he escaped. This is what made him. This is what he said. I'm quoting him, quote, "The battle with C.O.R.E was a turning point in my career as a slave." Now, isn't that funny that a slave would have a career? But again, notice he'd call him Mr. C.O.R.E, and, you know, all of this, the politeness of the African who despised the person he was referring to, you know, but a career, yeah, hardly. So he says, this battle with C.O.R.E was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers, those are the sparks or flames of freedom, and revived within me, listen to this, my own sense of manhood. That's the most important thing that the ultimate system of healing does. If you didn't already have it, it restores it. Man or woman, your manhood or your womanhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence, that self-confidence that he said he had lost when he felt broken, and inspired me again with a determination to be free. That's the key thing. That's what manhood and womanhood is all about. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. In other words, it was better to beat him than to live as a cringing slave. You hear me? Key. He can only understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced, who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. Oh my, that sounds like Nat Turner. You see, this was just an individual battlefield for him, but it was the same bloody arm of slavery that had bloodied him. Now he's bloodying back. Huh. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. Listen to this. You hear me? My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place. That was the attitude of the average slave. You understand? He was acting out the cultural imperative of his people under circumstances that took a lot of courage to act out. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place. Check this out. And I now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. Oh, this is important. Slave in form meant, yeah, you're still on that plantation, but your mind and your spirit are not. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping me must also succeed in killing me, meaning he could die. It was going to be a battle to the death. You hear me? Now, the theme of this show is the Black liberation movements, an active culture, the ultimate healer of trauma, stress, low self-esteem, and the ultimate source of freedom, mentally and spiritually. As I noted earlier, the individual acts of resistance are acts of culture, and they're acts of cultural resistance. Frederick Douglass rose from brokenness to manhood, from loss of self-confidence to defying self-confidence. Defiant self-confidence. He rose from the state where he lacked elasticity, meaning flexibility, the ability to act freely, and his timing and everything else had been subject to the time of the master, and now he was timing the blows on Kobe's head and body. His individual fight was a single blow against slavery, just as the slave rebellions were collective blows. Most importantly, through resistance, Frederick Douglass overcame the ultimate of all things that maintain self-imposed slavery, fear. This was the most important thing, that he had revived inside of himself courage, in fact, greater courage than he had ever experienced before, because it was paid with a price on the battlefield where his life was at stake. So manhood and womanhood was restored because he was prepared to cross the threshold of life, which is death, stare it in square in the face, and fight like his life depended on it, which it did. So Douglass's beating of Covey gives full meaning to the song, "Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave." Through whipping the bloody arm of slavery, Frederick Douglass had ceased being a slave in fact. This is what the song means. Before I'll be a slave. In fact, yeah, you're in the circumstance of slavery, but mind and spirit doesn't accept it. Through escaping from enslavement, he ceased being a slave in form, but his true freedom wasn't the physical freedom. It was a freedom of the mind and the spirit, of the soul, that is the essence of freedom, because you can escape from freedom physically and still have the mentality of a slave. Just as you can get out of prison, escape, or be paroled and still be in prison. And a lot of us are in psychological prisons, mentally incarcerated. So the illusion of freedom just being physical, that is an illusion. Because if the mind and the spirit are not, the body isn't free. So liberation's an act of culture. Could it be that the spirit that arose inside of Frederick Douglass, telling him to fight, was the Spirit of God? The advice coming from Sandy? Or that root? Or a combination of all of them? What do you think? It was this newfound inner freedom that gave Frederick Douglass and many, many others the courage to risk everything by escaping from enslavement, which meant escaping from your friends and family. Douglass's resurrection from the tomb of mental slavery was his passport to joining the abolitionist movement, first as a supporter of William Lloyd Garrison, and then as a leader of the Black abolitionist movement, a leader in his own right, and the greatest of the Black abolitionist leaders. From a person whose interest in reading had nearly been extinguished by C.O.R.E, the light of inquiry was in full flame with his defeat of C.O.R.E, and he was able to extinguish the dark night of slavery that had closed his mind and creativity. And after escaping from slavery, this one who had almost lost an interest in reading founds the newspaper, the North Star, which was symbolic of freedom, since that's the star that escaped slaves marked as the direction point to the north. And so he becomes the publisher and major writer in his own newspaper that exposed the evils of slavery to the North, to those in the South that could get their hands on it, especially blacks. This paper exposed the evils of slavery and demanded the abolition of slavery and the freedom of his brothers and sisters. Just as the closed fist of Frederick Douglass whipped the slave breaker C.O.R.E, so when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, that enabled slave masters to grab any black person off the street and return into bondage, whether they had papers of freedom or not, Douglass, who had been at that point an advocate of nonviolence tactically in the Black Convention movements, now becomes an advocate of self-defense. The man who had whipped C.O.R.E with his fist, the man who sometimes had to fight himself off of abolitionist speaking platforms when racist whites objected to what he had to say. Now he's calling on his people to pick up arms and defend themselves against any slave master that tries to re-enslave you. That was again the spirit of free men and women of color who were advocates for the ending of slavery. Frederick Douglass, Martin R. Delany, who was the most brilliant mind that we produced in this country in the 19th century, and other free men and women of color foresaw the coming of the Civil War and prepared for it. Douglass was a constant advocate for arming enslaved Africans, but only after Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation. And Douglass had been quite critical of Lincoln. And Lincoln himself was a racist like most whites, but he opposed slavery, but wouldn't do anything to abolish it. Met Frederick Douglass and made this comment: of the two men, me or Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass is the better man. He said, look where he came from. Both self-educated. But one out of the midnight of slavery, Frederick Douglass, a noble spirit. Douglass also prepared the ground internationally for the support of the abolition of slavery. This person whose light of freedom had nearly been snuffed out because he traveled to Britain not long after he had walked away from slavery, run away from slavery. He had written this book on that I just showed you on the narrative of my life, Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. And he brought that book to Britain and propagandized against slavery. That was crucial because at the point that Lincoln's on the verge of losing the Civil War, he reluctantly issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the reasons is to forestall, to prevent the ruling class in Britain from recognizing the South. Had they done so, the North may well have lost the Civil War because Britain was still the most powerful nation in the world, and they ruled the seas. They could block any trade coming into the United States, and they could ship in all the arms and soldiers they wanted to support the South. But it was the propaganda that Frederick Douglass and other anti-slavery leaders, but especially Frederick Douglass, did as he toured the United Kingdom and propagandized against slavery that led the white working class, a racist group, as the working class of whites had proven to be all over the world, and led them to do something they normally have not done: support the cause of the enslaved. And so when the ruling class of Britain, the aristocracy, and the industrial merchants wanted to endorse the South in the Civil War, it was a work of Douglass and others that shifted that opinion to supporting coming from the white working class based on Douglass and others' teachings that led the working class to say they supported the African in America. They supported their freedom, and the British ruling class better not side with the South. And that made a big difference in the outcome of the war, as did the 170,000 blacks who got their trusty rifles and started blowing away Southern slave masters, including Frederick Douglass's sons. Douglass was too old to fight in the war. He would have loved to. And of course, as I pointed out before, Martin R. Delaney was made a major in the Civil War, the highest rank of any black, and served the role of recruiting Civil War fighters among blacks. So Frederick Douglass is an example of how individual resistance creates the mental freedom that prepares the individual for participation in the greater movement for liberation, both of which are ultimate healers of fear, trauma, stress, low self-esteem, and as Gloria Thomas said, frees you from Plantation 101. I like that term she had, meaning the introduction to the plantation mentality, politics, and everything else, and is the ultimate gateway to freedom. So if you want to relieve your personal stress, your personal pain, there's a lot of things you need. You need sometimes the professional stuff that will help you, as these two ladies had offered their help. And some of you have probably doing that work yourself or have had that work done for you. So that's certainly important. But to relieve your personal stress and personal pain, ultimately, you got to go to the ultimate source of mental and spiritual freedom and transfer the stress and pain from you to your oppressor. Delegate your stress, delegate your high blood pressure, delegate your potential heart attacks and internal pain, including addictions of various kinds, especially your addiction to whiteitis. People want to know what that means, wanting to be white, or the desire to be approved by whites. Transfer that to your oppressor, the way old Frederick Douglass did, the way those of us who are warriors do. And I feel kinship with this topic because it matches my experience. You know what I mean? Best experience I had in my life was taking part in the Black Liberation Movement, 61 years of it. I've just talked about one little phase. I've been in all kinds of movements, all kinds of organizations, and that is what I'm most proud of, and then scholarship and all that. But that is that fight that freed my mind, that opened my eyes up to the truth that comes from our people, everyday Black folks, and the exceptional ones who we know about, the Malcolms and the Garveys and people like that. And so it was through that process that I experienced my awakening. My battle wasn't personal, physical. Mine was collective against institutions. And the only movement that took on the corporations and kicked their behind from top to bottom, organized our people on a mass base, wholesale, built housing, formed alliances and coalitions, didn't suffer a defeat. And that is like the foundation on which I grow organically. And so I can relate to this. You know what I mean? So the sixfold stages to mental freedom, those are experiences. That's not some theory. Those are stages of growth and development, you know. Frederick Douglass went through some of those. Martin R. Delaney went through those. Malcolm went through those. King went through those. Ella Baker went through those. Ella Baker was one of the best manifestations of Black culture. And she also took on identity with Africa. But she came out of the best of Black culture coming out of North Carolina, just as John Coltrane did. And her resistance movements that she inspired were direct extensions of her own cultural experiences when she encouraged the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to follow group leadership. She was reproducing what she had experienced in South Carolina, in North Carolina, group-centered leadership. She was reproducing that community that she had experienced in the South, led by her grandfather, who was a landowner and sublet land to family members and helped people out in distress, was the preacher, built his own church on his own land, and built the first school. Her sense of excellence comes from that, you know. So she represents the best of Black culture, just as Coltrane did musically. These are two people I look at in the book I'm finishing on Sever right now as masters. So when we look at Frederick Douglass, his resistance was ultimately an act of culture. And in freeing his mind, it enabled him to have something to offer to our people, something great. But this is true for our people as a whole. So I know some of you are engaged in something in your community to improve it, to uplift it, to liberate it. And those of you that aren't, you should get involved in something. If you're past the age where you can be physically active, then support people. But whatever it is, make a contribution. Apply what you read to your life. So that's it. Hope you got something out of this. What's going to happen on the 25th, which is Christmas, this show won't be live. I'm going to put up a speech, really a discussion that I had on YouTube a short while ago on the art of leadership. So that'll be up and people can watch that throughout the week. So that's it. Hotep. All right, let's see what's up here in terms of the chat. What we got here. Okay. Booba Smollett, my people. Right on. Got that right. Mr. Black Culture. Hey, I like that. Loving all this great insight needs to be spread all across the country. Yeah, help me get subscribers. Get people and just give them the information and tell them to subscribe, and then also watch the show. Lao Tzu, Dr. Tashaka Part 2. Amos and Marimba Ani were comrades. I believe that Saba in Plata would be an excellent guest as Wilson's continuation on this play. Okay, that's something I'll look at. You can tell me who that is. Lao Tzu, Part 1. Dr. Tashaka, Amos Wilson died before the completion of the book Blueprint for Black Power. It was completed by Saba in Plata, whom Amos called his brother. I believe he's still alive. Okay, that's who he is. Yeah, that's an excellent book. I mean, you talk about a thick book. I mean, I write some thick ones. He did too. And it's packed full of a lot of good information. By the way, have you considered being a moderator in that chat? It was a hectic week. We'll reach out to Dr. Tashaka about your address, Brother Ogawa. Dr. Tashaka, how can we structure our meetings such that all voices are heard, problems solved, the ideas are saved on, and participants feel a sense of well-being during at the end of the meeting? Well, right now, the only thing I know is in these chats. So if you got some other suggestions, in addition to the webinar we're talking about, let me know. Dr. Tashaka, we are working on establishing a cultural center here in the North. Any suggestions? That's good. Cultural centers are very important, and there are places where you can house a lot of information on our history and culture. I think one thing you need to do, and you probably already thought about this, is to contact people who have collections of any kind of information on our history and culture, particularly in your area, but nationally as well, that you can use and display. So that's one. Look at any film archives. That's another. Any kind of firsthand information on our history and culture, use it. But that's a good idea. Of course, you've got to secure a place. It needs to be something you own so that you can keep it, you know. Born eternal Lord Allah, righteous rebellion. Right on. Dr. Tashaka, are you and Marimba Ani two of the 40 people Clark took as apprentices? I don't know how many he took. Yeah, in fact, when Marimba Ani and I presented at ASCAT's conference in 1995 in Detroit before 1,000 people, she on her book, Urugu Mind, the Mother Principle, and I pointed this out before, John Henry Clark was there, Asa Hilliard was there, Dr. Leonard Jeffries was there, Jane Smalls, Wade Nobles, and many others. And so I called him the following week and I said, well, what did you think of our presentation? His comment was, I came to see my replacements. Now, what that meant was that he figured, he always said he had a mind better than any 40 people. So it meant that he had a number. And so we were among those. So that was a nice compliment. Tito District, Baba Tashaka, how would you compare your analysis of semi-colonialism to the theory of internal colonialism? It is in the sense that it's domestic, but what's different is it's not full-blown colonialism. That's the problem. Amilcar Cabral was here shortly before he was killed. He received a honor at one of our Black educational institutions, and he was asked that very question. Do Black communities represent colonies? Are they colonies or are they domestic colonies? His answer was no, because they lacked a contiguous land base. Meaning, normally, if you're talking about a colony, then it's usually a piece of land that someone else has taken from a people and colonized them. So then decolonization is to return that power to the people. So generally, people who represent an internal colony or a domestic colony are people who share that, but not always, because in the case of Native Americans, they're a domestic colony on separate reservations because they were taken off their land. And their problem is they don't have the power to get it back. And they face genocide of 90%. The same thing with the Palestinians. The Gaza and West Bank are separate, but that's imposed on them. That's not their original land, which is Israel, you know. But generally, contiguous land is one part of it. Generally, if you're going to have an internal colony or a domestic colony, then freedom would really involve independence. It would lead to people having their own government, their own state, their own economy, their own political system, and so forth. We are a nation within a nation of people with a common culture. But that isn't what would happen here, because we're spread out in different parts of the country, you know, heavily spread in the South, and then on the East Coast, parts of the Midwest, somewhat in the West, you know. That's hard for a decolonized situation to prevail. So I call it semi-colonialism because it has aspects of colonialism. But the outcome for our liberation isn't going to be just, you know, setting up a nation state of just Africans. That ain't going to work here. So that's why I talk about restructuring. And that's why Malcolm and King ended up in that position. And that's the reality of what needs to happen right now. Restructuring. And restructuring on many different levels. Okay, it looks like that's it. I'm going to go down and see if there's anything on the bottom again. No, that's it. Okay, that's it. So I hope you got something out of that. Until 2 weeks from now, next week, you'll have a recording on the art of leadership, and then we'll be back the following week, which is the last day of Kwanzaa. So Hotep.